Greetings! We switched gears a bit in this module to think more specifically about how we can apply what we know about social identification to understand leadership, emergence, and effectiveness. As you may have gathered from reading in the last module, the New Psychology of Leadership text outlines a theory of leadership based on social identity and self-categorization theories. They draw on extensive research in explaining 4 points that they term rules of leadership. We'll consider the first of those rules, that leaders need to be in-group prototypes, in this module, and the remaining rules in the next 3 modules. As we learned in the last module, the theories and research related to social identity indicate our sense of self includes at least 2 parts. Our personal identity is based on our unique characteristics, and the social identity that incorporates the wide range of ways we interact with others. Another way to think about it is that the personal identity is I and me, while social identity is us and we. Those 2 perspectives are associated with different patterns of behavior. Given those patterns of behavior, applying the identity theory of leadership would suggest that we need to expand our definition of leadership to indicate that leadership is a process of managing social identity within the group. The rules I mentioned earlier each contribute to that process, as depicted by this graphic. And this graphic is from an article by the same authors who wrote our text, and it's referenced in a summary with the resources for this module. From this perspective, leadership is much more dynamic and fluid than the other theories suggest. The social context is always changing, and each change influences the sense of social identity. For example, you might think about how various political issues have influenced individuals who identify with ethnic groups, genders, and sexual orientation, to name a few. It becomes even more complicated, though, when we think about the work of the leader as being part of a system within that social context. In other words, the leader's influence in the group and the resulting social action can change the social context. That, in turn, can change the way the members of the group identify, which can, in turn, influence who emerges as a leader. That influence on leadership emergence is reflected in the first rule of identity leadership, that a leader must be seen as prototypical of the group. In the article I mentioned earlier, the authors identify 3 components of prototypicality, listed in this slide. They can be summarized by saying that a leader who is prototypical is seen as being similar to the others in the group and distinctively different from members of other groups. But we need to put an asterisk next to similar to. The authors note that it's not just about being like the average group member, it's about being like this ideal group member, which might not be represented in all or other group members. Notice that the components of prototypicality all refer to the group, or this group. In other words, the characteristics vary from group to group, not unlike the way the pieces fit in a jigsaw puzzle. If we think about those points in context, that means that the outgroup is very influential in who emerges as a leader. In other words, individuals who are not in the group influence who emerges as a leader of those who are in the group. Related to the interdependence I mentioned earlier, that also means that a leader can influence changes that change the social context in a way that changes the group in a way that means they're no longer prototypical. That may be in part because those changes result in different views on the in-group and the out-group. The authors of the article summarize these ideas by saying, the prototypical position in the group shifts depending on features of the context at hand. At the most basic level, a leader is much less likely to be effective if they aren't prototypical, because they might not even emerge as a leader, and if they do, they're less likely to be able to influence the group. Members are also more likely to have positive feelings about the things they do at the request of a prototypical leader. Beyond that, the text also talks about the relationship between prototypicality and perceptions of fairness, trust, and charisma, all of which are related to more effective leadership. As we think about prototypicality and other parts of social identity leadership, it can also be interesting to think about how the ideas in the new psychology of leadership relate to the theories of roles that are used in more general discussions of group dynamics. As Forsyth mentions in group dynamics, the theories represent a few perspectives. The functional theory reminds me of the theories of leaderships that emphasize task leadership and relational leadership. But in this case, the theory suggests that different people in the group might address those needs of the group. Interactionist role theory focuses on the process, includes that different groups will have different roles. It might also be helpful to think about the concept of formal and informal roles as we're thinking about the ideas in the new psychology of leadership. When individuals are members of an established organization, there may be a formal structure with designated roles. For example, work settings often have managers or directors who oversee other employees, who are often referred to as subordinates. Social organizations can also have constitutions or bylaws that define formal roles in the organization, with titles like president. When we think about leadership, though, we might question whether the formal roles and titles are associated with leadership are actually associated with the influence in the group's informal structures. This module introduces the idea of social identity leadership to contribute to your understanding of how social identification influences leadership emergence and effectiveness. The concepts related to social identity theory help us begin to understand emergence. The authors of the New Psychology of Leadership use the term prototypicality to detail the implications of social identification, including those related to leadership across groups, as well as those related to leadership within a particular group. Considering those ideas in the context of group and organizational roles can provide additional perspectives on how the process plays out in different settings.